This is the Fujifilm GFX100 II, not two, the second. This is a medium format, what I would call hybrid video photo camera. The sensor is huge, the megapixels are huge, the image is ridiculous, and more importantly, this camera is a ton of fun to shoot with. Hey folks, it's Joey here from Tested, here to talk to you today about my test drive of this new Fujifilm medium format camera. Now, I don't review cameras on the site full time. I do it every now and then, but it's mostly because I find it important as a camera guy for Tested to stay up to date on all the new camera tech, all the new cameras, and see what can be important or useful for Tested's camera practices for the future. This isn't really that. This is almost purely selfish. I have a few friends that played with this camera. I saw some test footage of it. I got really excited about what I saw and about the aspect of shooting with a medium format camera, a format that I've never shot with. Full frame is as large as I've ever gone. Also, it's been tough with the last 5 years of cameras in terms of reviewing them because, in my opinion, cameras have all kind of plateaued. Sensors have all become really good. Cameras have all become really good. All the features that you saw on Micro Four Thirds that were like really groundbreaking at the time, I sort of trickled the way up to full frame cameras. So it became about what you preferred to shoot in, Sony, Panasonic, or Canon. But rarely ever did you hear Fujifilm in that conversation. And that's one of the exciting things about this is Fujifilm is now entering into that mirrorless content creator market with this camera. They rarely ever focused on video before. They made great photo cameras, great processors that did awesome emulation in terms of emulating looks from past vintage film stocks, but video was never something that they really focused on, which what makes this camera really exciting to try out. So let's crack into this thing a little bit. Fuji sent me this camera for about 2 weeks before I had to send it back, which is a good enough time to familiarize myself with the ecosystem, with the camera itself, but I didn't really get to take it on huge trips or big productions. So I'm gonna cover a lot of features here, but not everything. This camera has a lot going on, but I will highlight what I've been playing around with it the most. Now let's talk about the sensor on this camera because it is big and powerful. Now that's not a qualifier that I usually take with me when I'm looking for cameras to shoot. I'm typically a GH5 shooter. That's a Micro Four Thirds sensor. That's a tiny sensor, but it produces a really spectacular image and does what I needed to do very well. That doesn't mean that there are specific times, places, shoots that require a bigger sensor. You want a sharper image, you need more depth of field, more lensing options. There's plenty and plenty of times where full frame, most of the time full frame is probably preferable, but just because it's big and powerful doesn't mean that's what makes the camera great. It's really how you use it and how it fits into your project. But let's talk about the sensor. Here's a quick graphic of where medium format lives within the sensor world. Down here you can find Micro Four Thirds, again, which is what my GH5 does, which is very good quality 4K video. Full frame gives you more flexibility, bigger sensor sets to work with, and then the medium format is out here, the biggest of this bunch here. Now, I don't really focus too hard on specs when it comes to cameras. I have a range that I find acceptable, and then I sort of move out from there to other more important features for me from cameras. But I wanted to talk about the sensor, the megapixel count on this thing, because it's pretty dang big. 102 megapixels for this sensor. Some of the full frame cans we work with sort of hover around the 50 megapixel range. So this is 102 megapixels using a new processor engine that can handle that, which also means that it can handle a pretty good fast phase detect autofocus system. Now, I've heard mixed things about this autofocus system, mostly good. I had a pretty decent experience with it in terms of, doing portraits, people moving around, the camera kind of knowing what to catch onto, what to hold onto. But I didn't really have much luck with faster movement. I have a child that I was trying to focus in on, and she's way too fast. I did see the camera struggle a little bit with that, and I have seen some other people reiterate that same thing. So that's phase detect autofocus system. The resolution that this camera produces from a picture standpoint is huge. It's 11,648 by 8,736 pixels. That's pretty dang big. It's a pretty big photo, which means that even for large format printing of these photos you take from this camera, you'll have plenty of room to crop in and adjust your photo in post if you want to. One of the first pictures I took was of my wife at the base ISO of 80 outside. Super clean photo, but more impressively, I was able to zoom in post on her sunglasses and actually read the writing on the side of her sunglasses. That's what these medium format cameras can give you, that much clarity and that much clean sharpness from your photo. So for photo function here, you have your single shot, of course, but then you can switch over to burst settings at 5 or 8 frames a second if you really need to capture a specific moment in time. The sensor also has a very powerful IBIS. That's in-body image stabilization. This is one of the first features that Panasonic came out with the GH5 that was what drove me to that camera, because of I do a lot of handheld work and I need the sensor to sort of compensate for those jitters. Okay, so that's the sensor stuff. I'm itching to get to the video functions of this, but I do want to talk about the ISO real quick, because the ISO here is a little bit different than the way I typically think about it. The way I approach ISO usually is I find out what the camera manufacturer's base ISO is for that sensor. Oftentimes it's 400, sometimes it's 800. With our Sony FX6 at the office, we have a dual base, so I can swap between, I think it's 800 and 3200, for depending on what the conditions are I'm shooting, either dark or light. But I rarely ever go over the base, or I rarely ever even move around the base. If you go too high from the base ISO, sometimes you get a lot of digital noise, which can oftentimes look pretty ugly. If you go lower than the base, you're getting essentially like a, how would I explain it? Like a dimming of the image. Instead of the ISO changing, the ISO changes, but it actually just dims the image and you start to lose your dynamic range when you go too low. So there's a lot of little eccentricities when you start moving around your base ISO that I just tend to avoid. I tend to just stick with base, and I use other exposure tools to figure out what I need to expose with. This camera was a little bit different in terms of my relationship with grain and base ISO. Again, I typically always avoid digital noise on cameras. I've also worked on smaller sensor cameras, Super 35s, Micro Four Thirds. And typically those grain patterns, those digital noise patterns are much more pronounced. But as you increase your sensor size, the grain patterns become much finer, much smaller, and sometimes even cleaner, or sort of fall off in the background. That's what I found with this camera. I was sticking at the 80, base ISO of 80, just to give myself that most dynamic range. They say you get like an extra third of a stop, I want to say, when you stick with 80. But I was able to go up to 800, 1600, 2500, and basically use that ISO to shoot in low light situations, and not only have very, very tight minimal grain. You have to really zoom in to find that grain, but I actually found that grain kind of nice. Like the grain texture on this camera is actually one of the better ones I've seen in terms of digital cameras. Like it looks more like a filmic grain. So either way, I was fine with going way over the base ISO, both on the photo mode, and then for video, the base ISO was 800. I tried to stick with that as much as I could, but I was able to push myself a little bit higher there in dealing with 4K and 8K video and still have a pretty pleasing grain pattern there. So now let's move over to the video features on this camera, because that was the biggest selling point for me, was that it feels and operates much like a video camera. Sure, it looks like a mirrorless, very big mirrorless camera, but like the Canon R5C, you have a little physical switch here that you can go from still to movie mode, which then changes the interface a little bit to give you those options that you need for video. Frame rates, resolutions, codecs. You have a ton of different flavors of all of these. For codecs, one of the most exciting things for me was having internal Apple ProRes 422 10-bit. This is a professional codec that is used on many, many, many cameras. It is very editing system friendly. It works really well with data when you start to push and pull colors. It's just a very nice near lossless codec that this camera can record in internally on the CFast Type B cards. A lot of times you have to HDMI out to an external monitor, which can do ProRes, but now more and more now I see that a lot of cameras are going towards the ProRes format because just that much data is now being poured out of the sensor into storage, and those storage containers like the CFast Type B or CFast Type A or whatever you're using can hold that sort of data. The SD cards, this has an SD slot, but you notice right when you put an SD card in here, you start to lose those formats. You start to lose a lot of video options because that card just can't handle that much data. CFast B card can, Apple ProRes, all sorts of flavors of Apple ProRes depending on what you want. The camera can output H.264 or H.265, but you'll have the most data with ProRes, aside from RAW if you're doing RAW HDMI out, which you can on this camera, and a monitor that is compatible with that. So for resolutions, it can do 8K video up to 30K. If you're publishing in 8K, 30 will be your limit. If you want to do some overcranking, you will not be able to do that unless you drop down to 4K video, which does up to 60 frames a second total. So again, if you're publishing in 4K, you're shooting things at 24, you can overcrank that to 48 and 60 and have some slower footage in there. But if you want to go really, really slow, this camera can go up to 120 frames a second at HD 1080. Now, the reason that these are all changing is because, again, these cameras are basically computers. So the computer processors happening in here. as you start adding more frames, as you start asking it to do more, you need to compromise in other spaces. And so that's a very typical thing for a lot of cameras. A lot of cameras have either a reduced data rate, reduced codec, more compression. In this case, it is resolution and frame rates that are sort of correlated together as you're asking the camera to do these kind of things. For me, most of the stuff that I shoot is at 4K 24 with B-roll coverage rolling at about 48 to 60 frames a second. So we have some slightly slowed down stuff to have some flexibility there. Now again, this feels like a video camera both in design, but also the UI as well. It wants you to mount cinema lenses on here, and the camera will actually change its settings based on what lenses you have on here. So this is your GF lens. This is your native lens to the camera. This will use the most amount of sensor. This is sort of optimized for this camera. And when you're using these lenses, I have a 55 mil here, and then I also have a tilt shift 30 mil that they sent me. When I'm using those lenses on this camera, it knows what settings to change within it to adjust for that. There's also the Premista lenses. Now these are high-end cinema lenses. I saw these lenses a few years back at an ASC Clubhouse event. These are massive cinema zooms that were, I think, outfitted on a Sony Venice at the time. But if you have access to one of these lenses, you can put this on this camera and rig this thing out for some pure cinematic magic. Again, when you switch over to the Premista settings, it'll change everything in here to compensate for what that lenses are doing. And I'll explain that as we get to anamorphic, because this camera also does anamorphic adapting. I tried this out a bunch with the anamorphic adapter for this mount, and then some anamorphic lenses, and it worked beautifully. Now, why is it important that the settings change? Is because things like I said, IBIS, the camera sensor is actually like moving around to compensate for shakiness, but it's wanting the spherical lens image to be placed onto that sensor. So it knows how to shake within the spherical image being projected onto the sensor. But an anamorphic is a little bit strange, right? It's oval. So the image itself, and you're de-squeezing that in post, the image itself is getting kind of distorted as it hits that sensor. And so when you have IBIS moving around, the sensor moving around with that anamorphic image hitting the sensor, and then you de-squeeze that, you have a lot of weirdness and wobbliness. So oftentimes, if you don't make the settings right, your image will just look like an ocean of madness. And so for the GH5, for example, I had to put on an anamorphic lens on that camera, and then I have to go through all the menu settings and say like, okay, all right, your IBIS, I'm using an anamorphic for IBIS, so compensate for that. Or let me turn off this setting because I know it doesn't work well with anamorphic. And if you miss one of those things, it's kind of a bummer because then your footage all has a little bit of funk to it that you didn't really want. The nice thing about this is that it'll automatically do all that stuff for you because it knows that you want to use that lens, and it knows that you don't want those other features to be inhibiting the way you're capturing that image. And then lastly, you have Super 35. So Super 35 is a format I've worked in for years and years and years. There's so much glass out there. It's such a nice camera format to work in, and glass up the wazoo. So if you have any lenses for Super 35 that you want to make sure you mount correctly on here, then you change that setting over there, and the camera will compensate for that. Now, like I said at the top of this video, Fuji has been making fantastic photo cameras for years and years that are beloved by a lot of people. But with all of these modes in here, all these video modes, all these lens options, what all that is telling me is that they are now ready to enter into this mirrorless video market with something truly unique in the medium format. There's no other manufacturers in that prosumer mirrorless range that are shooting medium format. That's usually a format that is reserved. That size sensor, that's usually reserved for big budget films shooting on Alexa 65s, which isn't often, but that is a massive format that is being shot on those films. And now you may have a C camera or something that is comparable to that sensor size and ecosystem. Film emulation, again, is a big thing with Fuji users, and that has been translated over to this camera. You have your just standard mode, which is just, I guess, the cleanest style neutral image that you can get. And then you can shuffle through all sorts of different film emulators that I assume that Fuji has been working on for a long time, since they've been around forever. I haven't been a huge Fuji photo shooter, so I can't tell you to the degree of how accurate these are to the actual film stocks that they're replicating. But what I can tell you is that there is a new one in this camera that a lot of people are very excited about called Reala Ace. That is a type of film stock that has some kind of big history here that I will butcher if I even try to get into. So I will just tell you that there are a ton of people who are really excited about it. It basically gives it a little bit gentler of a contrast from what I've seen. It mutes down the greens and the odd yellows and blues just a little bit. So if you go shoot outside, oftentimes, or at least for me, oftentimes I'm out shooting in nature and like forests and stuff, and those greens just, boom, they just become too much. And so I often go into Lightroom and sort of tease down those greens a little bit. It does some stuff with the skin, just softens it up and warms it up in certain ways. So it looks really nice to me. It was probably one of my favorite film emulations on here. The rest I used were a little bit more dramatic, bleach bypass. That was a very deliberate choice to mess with. But they're all pretty fun to mess around with. And again, you have your RAW and JPEG that is produced from taking photos. And so you can always take your RAW into Lightroom and then have your JPEGs to be experimental with those film emulations. But yeah, Reola Ace, it's new and a lot of people are excited about it, and that is something on this camera. So physically, this camera is big. It is big. It's gonna have to be big because that sensor size is huge. The glass needs to be huge to accommodate that. The lenses are all big. It's not terribly heavy, but it's pretty, it's got some weight. This isn't a camera you're gonna put long lenses on and go out and do wildlife shooting on. It is very much a portrait and general use camera system that you're gonna be shooting on. In terms of dials, all your dials and all the buttons are exactly where you expect them to be on these cameras. It's become pretty standardized, but this more modern design that Fuji has went with, I think is a good choice. They usually go with a little more of a retro design, but I sort of like this. It's familiar. The grips all feel nice. Like I said, the customizable buttons are kind of where they feel the best at. The dials have some options with display. You have this optional viewfinder that you can attach on. The LCD screen articulates in 3 ways. It gives you some view for your landscape shots, and then it adjusts out for portrait shots, but it doesn't do that selfie swinging out mode that has become much more popular with mirrorless cameras. Full-size HDMI. Full-size HDMI is the only way to go at this point. Please don't put micro HDMIs onto your cameras. Those are dinky, but again, this thing needs to throw out raw 8K signals, and so you got a nice full size there. You got USB-C, your 3.5 audio jack, and then you have this LAN port here that you can use camera to cloud. For those folks who don't know, camera to cloud is like a Frame.io, Adobe thing that basically allows you to upload your video files sort of as you shoot them to a cloud that an editor can start working on. It's really great in concept. We've never had to use it. We've never had that kind of turnaround, but I have known folks who have used camera to cloud quite religiously, where as they're shooting, those files are basically pushing out to the cloud, and editors are like exporting out videos pretty much as the shoot is being wrapped. And so you have those options. That's all built in here. Your CFast Type B slot, your SD card slot. I did have a little bit of problems with the UI itself is pretty intuitive to navigate through, but I did have some weird issues with like just getting things set to where I wanted it to be. This is getting to some pedantic stuff, but like when I'm moving through the quick settings and I'm trying to adjust ISO or I'm trying to adjust settings, when you use the touchscreen versus when you use the dial is never really quite clear. There's oftentimes the camera wants you to use the dial for certain things, and then when you start touching, that doesn't work, and vice versa. It wants you to use your dial to move around things, but then it wants you to use your finger to touch things, and you can't just press into the dial to select those things. It's gonna be very hard for me to explain all this, but it's one of those things that as you start using the camera, you realize that doesn't quite match the way it should be. There's a ton to this camera that I'm probably just glossing over because 2 weeks is not a whole lot of time to really put this thing through the ringer and just beat it and figure out what is up with every single feature. But what I can tell you is this camera sort of excited me the way I got excited all those years back when Panasonic released the GH5. It made shooting really fun. It made putting a camera in my hand and going out really, really fun, which is kind of what is most important to me. It's why I stuck with the GH5 for so long, even as all these other cameras sort of came out and started blowing the features away in the GH5. The GH5 became it was so intuitive for me. It sort of spoke the language of my video brain. It felt like a video camera. As the rest of the cameras, I was sort of brute forcing to work with me, even though they had better features. I still preferred using the GH5, and that's what this camera is allowing me, is giving me that feeling again. Is that giving me that feeling of joy of shooting that I'd love to have. I'd love to go out and shoot with something that sort of speaks the language of video and allows me to switch back between photo and video, capture all the moments I want to capture in nice quality image using formats and resolutions that I love to work with in post-production, and so on. Now, again, I'm not a medium format shooter, so I can't tell you how this thing compares to like a Hasselblad or other medium format cameras, but I can tell you that the video features being thrown into this are very exciting. I'm very happy to see Fuji being part of the conversation now when it comes to video. I can't tell you whether this is a good buy or not. This is a very expensive camera. This is $7,500 for this camera body, and then you're investing into glass that is gets a little bit more pricey as well. This entire system is going to be a pricey hobby, and so you really need to be into portrait or medium format photography, and then you need to do a ton of your own research to figure out if this is the camera for you. But I can say that I had a ton of fun playing with it, and I think that everybody should at least mess with a medium format camera at some point just to mess around and see how it operates and see how they can capture images in a kind of a unique way. So thank you guys again for joining me, and I will catch you guys next time on another tested camera review video in the future. Until then,